This week, we're going to take a look at some really significant developments from April 21st to 27th, 2025. We're focusing on news that impacts the LGBTQ plus community, well, pretty much around the world. We've gathered info from various news sources to try and give a clear picture of what's been going on and, importantly, why it matters.
Exactly. These things are often connected.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe the UK. There was that big Supreme Court ruling that definitely got people talking.
Yes, let's start there. It involves for Women Scotland and the Scottish government. And it really boils down to how woman and sex are legally defined in the 2010 Equality Act.
Okay.
So the Supreme Court came out with a unanimous decision. They basically said that within that specific act, woman and sex refer to biological sex.
Right, biological sex.
Yeah. Lord Patrick Hodge, he summarized it pretty directly, saying the unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act refer to a biological woman and biological sex.
Wow, okay. Unanimous. That's quite definitive, legally speaking.
It is. And the potential implications, well, they could be really wide-ranging, especially for the trans and non-binary community when it comes to things like single-sex spaces.
So this really brings up how these legal definitions impact everyday life, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a clear example of that. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, they reacted pretty fast.
They did. What did they say?
Well, they issued a warning, basically saying the NHS could be pursued, that was the word used, if their single-sex space policies aren't updated to align with this ruling.
Pursued. So facing action.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
Baroness Kishwar-Faulkner, she's the EHRC chairwoman. She mentioned they'd be asking for timelines for these policy updates. It shows how quickly these regulatory bodies are moving to, well, interpret and maybe enforce this ruling.
Okay, so after the ruling, the EHRC didn't just issue warnings, they put out some interim guidance, too. That seems like the next logical step to understand.
It does, and it's crucial for understanding the sort of immediate practical side of things. The guidance basically says that in places like hospitals, shops, restaurants, trans women, biological men, should not be permitted to use the women's facilities.
Okay, that's quite direct.
It is. But, and this is really important, they also stressed that trans people shouldn't be left without any facilities at all. So it's a bit of a balancing act.
Right, trying to implement the ruling, but also ensure basic access. It sounds like a lot hinges on how they view gender recognition certificates, GRCs.
Precisely. The EHRC made it clear that for the purpose of this specific ruling under the Equality Act, having a GRC doesn't change a person's biological sex in the eyes of this guidance.
So legally, in this context.
In this context, according to the EHRC guidance based on the ruling, a trans woman is a biological man and a trans man is a biological woman. That distinction is really key to understanding their recommendations.
Okay. Now, what about trans men? The guidance mentioned excluding them from women's facilities, too. That sounds a bit more complicated.
It is a bit more nuanced. It relates back to something the Supreme Court mentioned, a reasonable objection clause.
Ah, okay.
So the EHRC guidance suggests that in certain women-only services, maybe like rape crisis counseling, a trans man might be excluded if their appearance or other attributes could, reasonably cause offense or concern to the service users.
Reasonably cause concern. That sounds subjective.
Very. Akua Reindorf KC, a lawyer involved, clarified it would have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But again, the bottom line they keep repeating is that a trans person should always have access to a toilet. Somewhere.
It's a real tightrope walk, isn't it? Between the legal interpretation and the practical realities on the ground.
Absolutely. And to try and help navigate that, the EHRC did suggest some practical things.
Like what?
Well, things like providing mixed-sex facilities where possible, or maybe individual lockable rooms alongside the single-sex ones. Trying to offer options, basically.
Okay, that makes sense. What about schools? That's always a flashpoint in these discussions.
Yeah, the guidance addresses schools specifically. It advises that trans girls, biological boys, shouldn't use the girls' toilets or changing rooms. And likewise, trans boys, biological girls, shouldn't use the boys.
So separate facilities again?
They suggest the need for suitable alternative provisions. What that looks like in practice in every school. Well, that will likely need very careful thought to make sure everyone's safe and included.
And this guidance, it doesn't just stop at public places and schools. It affects clubs and associations too.
That's right. If a group or club has 25 or more members, the EHRC suggests that women-only or lesbian-only groups shouldn't be required to admit trans women.
Oh, okay.
And similarly, men-only or gay men-only groups wouldn't be required to admit trans men. Again, it reflects that court focus on biological sex in the act.
But we need to remember this is interim guidance. It's not set in stone yet.
Exactly. It's important. The EHRC is planning a 2-week consultation in May to get feedback from everyone involved.
Okay, so there's a chance for input.
Yes. And the goal is to get an updated final code of practice to the government for approval by the end of June. It's a pretty quick timeline, which suggests they feel a real urgency to get this clarified.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at the political reactions in the UK. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, his position seems to have, well, evolved quite a bit on trans rights over the last few years.
That's putting it mildly. Yeah, it's a significant observation. You look back to, say, 2020 at the Pink News Awards, and he was talking about a desperate need to reform the Gender Recognition Act, bring in self-ID for trans people.
I remember that.
But his reaction to this Supreme Court ruling, it paints a rather different picture as part of a wider trend, this evolution in political stances.
So what did he say about the ruling?
He welcomed it, said it provided a much-needed clarity. He even went on to say a woman is an adult female, kind of implying the Supreme Court had settled the what is a woman question.
Whoa, okay. That's a definite shift from supporting self-ID. A clear alignment with the biological definition from the court.
It seems so. And it's not just him. Other senior labor people, like Bridget Phillipson, have also signaled support for the ruling. She suggested trans women shouldn't use female toilets anymore.
So it looks like a broader shift within the Labour Party.
It certainly signals that.
Yeah.
It does make you wonder what's driving these changes in their public discourse, you know?
And this wasn't the first sign of a change on these issues from Labour, was it? They'd already shifted on self-ID before this ruling.
They had. You're right. Back in 2020, their official policy was basically updating the GRA to include self-declaration. But by 2023, Annalise Dodds, who was the Shadow Equality Secretary then, she made it clear Labor would keep the requirement for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria to get a GRC.
Ah, okay. So that was already a step back from full self-ID.
A clear step back, yeah. It shows the debate was already happening within the party.
And Starmer's own words on defining a woman have been, well, inconsistent.
Fluid, perhaps. He's gone from saying trans women are women in the past to more recently using phrases like, for 99.9% of women, is completely biological. And of course, they haven't got a penis.
Right.
And then later, just defining a woman as an adult female. The Prime Minister's spokesperson just stated that following the Supreme Court, the government views a woman as a biological woman. It aligns with the court's reading of the Equality Act.
So consistent with the ruling, any other parties weigh in?
Yeah.
The Greens, maybe?
Yes. The Green Party took a different line. They actually called for the EHRC's guidance on single-sex spaces to be withdrawn completely.
Okay, so showing a real range of political responses there.
Definitely. No consensus across the board.
Right. Let's widen the lens now. Look internationally. The situation in Russia sounds particularly bleak for the LGBTQ plus community.
It does indeed. Very concerning. The Russian Ministry of Justice has officially named a journalist, Vadim Vaganov, as the first actual member of this so-called international LGBT public movement.
Which isn't really a formal movement at all, is it? Wasn't it just labeled extremist in a blanket way by their court?
Exactly. It's not a real organization with membership lists. The Russian Supreme Court made that ruling back in November 2023, labeling this vaguely defined movement as extremist, but they didn't name any individuals then.
So how did Vaganov get singled out?
Apparently, his connection is through an online publication called Parny Plus. It focuses on LGBTQ plus sexual health, relationships, social issues, that sort of thing. This is designation, him being named as a member, it cropped up in legal documents about him being labeled a foreign agent.
Ah, I see. So it's another layer of persecution, really.
It really looks like a further tightening of the screws on any kind of LGBTQ plus advocacy or even just information sharing in Russia.
And Parny Plus, it sounds like it provides a really vital service, especially now.
Oh, absolutely. Given the state-sponsored hostility, having a resource for information on HIV prevention, mental health, just community issues, it's critical. Targeting people linked to platforms like that is deeply worrying.
Moving across the globe to Algeria, there were some truly awful statements from a politician there.
Yes, deeply disturbing. An Algerian parliamentarian, Fawzi Ben Ammar, made these incredibly inflammatory remarks during a debate. He was calling for much harsher penalties, including, shockingly, execution.
Execution for whom?
For people pretending to be women, as he put it, or anyone trying to change their gender. Just horrifying rhetoric.
That's beyond belief. Calling for execution. How have people reacted?
Well, as you can imagine, it sparked huge controversy and outrage, both in Algeria and internationally. People rightly condemned it as incitement to violence and discrimination. It really highlights the dangers LGBTQ plus people face in some parts of the world and the need for protection against hate speech.
Absolutely horrifying. Okay, let's try and find a slightly more positive note, maybe. In the U.S., Minnesota took some action.
Yes, a legal challenge. Minnesota joined other states in suing the Trump administration. This is over the administration's threat to pull federal school funding from states that don't get rid of their DEI programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right, the DEI pushback. So Minnesota is fighting that.
They are. Attorney General Keith Ellison is leading the charge there, basically challenging the federal directive as being vague, confusing, and incorrect in how it interprets Title VI anti-discrimination law.
And there's serious money involved.
Huge amounts. Potentially over $13.8 billion in education funding nationwide, with Minnesota itself standing to lose at least $530 million. So the stakes are very high for schools.
Wow, that's a significant fight over educational policy and funding. Has there been any movement on that?
Well, alongside that state lawsuit, there was a separate case brought by the National Education Association and the ACLU, and a federal judge actually sided with them, issuing a preliminary injunction. Meaning it temporarily blocks the Trump administration's directives that threaten to cut funding over DEI programs. So the legal system seems to be pushing back, at least for now.
Okay, that's definitely a development worth watching. Finally, let's reflect a bit on the passing of Pope Francis and his legacy regarding the LGBTQ plus community. It was always a complex relationship, wasn't it?
It really was. Multifaceted is a good word.
Mm.
You have things like the Vatican document Dignitas Infinitas, which caused a lot of disappointment and concern, particularly for trans and intersex people.
Yeah, I remember the reaction to that.
But then you also have these very personal accounts from LGBTQ plus Catholics who felt a real connection with him, who saw something different.
Like Maxwell Kuzma. He's a transgender Catholic man, and he shared a story about meeting Pope Francis.
He did, and it was powerful. He talked about how validating it was, how he felt the Pope's genuine warmth and welcome, despite, all the stigma he faces elsewhere. That encounter made him feel like he belonged in the church.
That personal touch seems to have meant a lot.
Kuzma really stressed that Francis's actions went beyond just words. He pointed to tangible things.
Like what?
Like his ministries specifically for transgender sex workers in Rome, the fact that he regularly met with LGBTQ plus individuals, his public support for LGBTQ plus Catholic ministries, actions speaking louder than words, perhaps.
That's interesting. And wasn't there something about transgender people at his burial?
Yes, quite poignant. A small group of transgender individuals were actually among those who paid their respects right at his burial site in Santa Maria Maggiore.
Really? How did that come about?
Apparently, they had links to a community of nuns who were supported by a bishop involved in the funeral plans. The Vatican's own description mentioned them, along with the poor, homeless prisoners, migrants, saying they expressed gratitude and saw him as a father. Their inclusion was quite noteworthy.
It really is. Guthrie Grace Fitzsimmons wrote an opinion piece about what Francis meant to LGBTQ plus Christians, didn't he? He focused on that famous "who am I to judge" line.
He did. And Grace Fitzsimmons argued that line, while maybe rhetorical, did signal a shift. He pointed to actual policy changes under Francis, too, allowing trans people to be baptized or be godparents, the blessings for same-sex couples, even if not marriage.
Small steps, maybe, but significant ones for those affected.
Exactly. And he also highlighted those personal meetings again, the support for inclusive ministries. He framed Francis's legacy as being about compassion, mercy over judgment, that idea of the church as a field hospital. So, while maybe not the revolution some wanted, these steps were deeply meaningful for many LGBTQ plus people of faith.
So wrapping up this week's deep dive, it feels like all these stories, though diverse, really connect around this theme of, well, evolving rights and acceptance or lack thereof for LGBTQ plus people globally.
Definitely. We've seen how legal definitions in one country, like the UK, can have immediate ripple effects. We've seen political stances shifting, sometimes quite dramatically.
And those stark contrasts internationally, from the hostility in Russia and Algeria to legal battles for inclusion in the US. And even within religion, that complex legacy of someone like Pope Francis.
It's just so important to remember that legal rulings, Like the UK Supreme Court one, they're significant, yes, but they're only one part of a much bigger picture. How these things are actually implemented, how they affect people's daily lives, that's still unfolding.
Yeah, and it really underlines the need to look past the headlines, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To understand the nuances, the gap between a ruling and enforcement, between rhetoric and policy, between big statements and individual experiences.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Which kind of leaves us, and you, with a final thought to ponder, maybe.
Go on.
Well, how will all these developments, the legal shifts, the political wins, the changing social views, how will they ultimately shape the future? The lived experiences, the sense of belonging for LGBTQ plus individuals everywhere in the coming years.
And maybe what role can each of us play in pushing for understanding and inclusion?
Exactly. Something to keep thinking about, keep exploring.